It was a quiet evening at the small hospital where she worked. The long corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the soft hum of machines was the only sound that kept the night alive. She had been on her feet all day, running from room to room, helping patients, calming worried families, and making sure everything ran smoothly. It was exhausting work, but she loved her job. Helping people gave her a sense of purpose, even when the pay was barely enough to cover her rent and bills. That evening, the hospital was hosting a small charity event to raise funds for new equipment. The lounge was decorated with flowers and colorful lights, and a few local donors and guests had arrived. She had been assigned to help with serving drinks and making sure everything went smoothly. She stood quietly in the corner, keeping to herself, watching the chatter and laughter of people who seemed so far removed from her world. They talked about vacations, business deals, and fancy restaurants. She felt invisible, a small shadow among them, carrying a uniform that reminded her of her hard life. Then suddenly, someone called her name. She turned quickly, not understanding at first. One of the organizers, with a polite but firm tone, asked her to play the piano. Her heart stopped. She glanced around nervously. She had never played in front of anyone, and the thought of performing terrified her. The piano sat in the center of the lounge, its polished black surface shining under the bright lights. The room seemed to hold its breath as eyes slowly turned toward her. She wanted to say no. She wanted to step back and disappear, but the organizer's gaze held a quiet insistence. Some of the guests exchanged amused looks, and she realized they were expecting entertainment. She felt a wave of panic wash over her. How could she perform? She wasn't trained. She wasn't prepared. And yet, all of a sudden, the room seemed to grow smaller, as if it were closing in on her. Her hands began to shake, and her legs felt frozen in place. As she approached the piano, whispers spread across the room. Some were curious, but others were mocking. She could feel the judgment in the air. "She's just a nurse. She can't play," someone muttered. Another chuckled quietly, and she felt the weight of their amusement pressing down on her. Her cheeks burned, a mix of embarrassment and fear. It felt like everyone was looking directly at her, seeing her fear. Waiting for her to fail, she took a deep breath and rested her hands lightly on the keys. The piano felt cold beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself, trying to tell herself that it was just a piano, just a room full of people, nothing to fear. But the truth was, fear had a hold on her. Her heart raced, and her mind spun with doubt. She imagined the laughter, imagined the whispers, imagined herself making a mistake that everyone would remember. The first note she played was shaky, uncertain. It sounded wrong even to her own ears. She almost pulled back, almost ran out of the room, but then she remembered something her grandmother had once told her. Courage isn't not feeling scared. Courage is what you do even when you're scared? That tiny thought gave her a spark of strength. She pressed the keys again, slowly, carefully, letting the sound fill the quiet lounge. The room remained still for a few moments, and she noticed something strange. The laughter and whispers began to fade, replaced by curiosity. People were watching her, yes, but not with ridicule anymore. They were watching her with interest, waiting to see what she would do next. The fear in her chest was still there, but it was mixed now with determination. She realized that this was her chance not to impress, not to prove herself, but to face the fear that had been holding her back for so long. And so, she continued to play, hesitant at first, but with each note, her confidence grew just a little. The music wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was hers. Every shaky note was filled with her effort, her courage, and her desire to keep going despite being humiliated and afraid. The first few notes had barely settled in the air when the whispers began again, louder this time. Some of the guests exchanged amused glances, smirks tugging at the corners of their mouths. "She doesn't even know what she's doing," one said quietly, but loud enough for others nearby to hear. Another chuckled and added, "Why are they even letting her touch the piano?" The nurse felt her stomach twist. Her hands hovered over the keys, frozen for a second. Every word, every laugh, felt like it was cutting through her. And she imagined all those eyes staring at her, waiting for her to mess up. Her palms were sweaty, her heart racing so fast she was sure it could be heard. She had never felt so small in her life. A few of the more confident guests began to make louder remarks. "If she even hits a single right note, I'll be surprised," one sneered. Another leaned toward his friend, whispering, "This is going to be entertaining, at least for us." Their voices were dripping with condescension, and the nurse could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. It was as if the room had turned into a stage where she was the punchline. She wanted to run. She wanted to throw her hands in the air and escape to the quiet hallway, away from their laughter and mocking eyes. But something inside her held her in place. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was sheer stubbornness. Or maybe it was the tiny spark of courage she had discovered in the last few notes she had played. Whatever it was, she forced herself to stay, even though every part of her body wanted to flee as she began to play again. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she pressed on. The notes sounded uncertain, a little jagged, but each one carried the honesty of her effort. She wasn't a trained pianist, and she knew it, but she refused to let their ridicule stop her. Even as some guests snickered quietly, she tried to focus only on the music and not on the sharp edges of their words. Still, the mockery didn't stop. "Oh, this is painful to watch," someone muttered, and a few others chuckled. The nurse felt her face flush with shame. She was humiliated. She could almost feel the heat of judgment burn across her skin. Her hands ached from tension, her shoulders stiffened, and yet she continued. Each note she struck was a tiny act of defiance against the fear that tried to control her. A woman in the back leaned closer to her friend and whispered, "I don't know why they even asked her to play. She's just a nurse. How could she possibly know anything about music?" Those words stung the most. It wasn't just that they doubted her skill, they doubted her worth, her place in the room. Her very ability to try. The nurse's eyes flicked to the piano keys. And for a moment her mind screamed at her to stop. She imagined leaving the piano behind and slipping quietly out of the room. But then she took a deep breath, remembering why she had agreed to step up in the first place. She wasn't just playing for the guests or to prove them wrong. She was playing for herself, for the courage it took just to sit there. Despite the humiliation and fear, slowly, very slowly, she began to find a rhythm. The first few notes had been shaky, uncertain, but now she allowed herself to listen to the sound, to feel it under her fingers. The music wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was something sincere and raw in it that couldn't be mocked. Even as some guests continued to snicker, a few silent ones leaned forward. Their curiosity piqued. Her fingers moved more confidently with each passing moment, though a part of her still trembled. Every glance from the audience, every whisper felt like a test. Would she crumble under the pressure? Or would she keep going despite the fear? The nurse chose to keep going. Each note a small rebellion against the shame and doubt pressed onto her by strangers as she played. She noticed something changing. The laughter and snickers didn't disappear immediately, but some of the guests began to pause, listening a little more closely. Their amusement was still there, hidden in the corners, but curiosity was creeping in. The music, unpolished though it was, carried emotion, sincerity, and a strange beauty that no one expected. She could feel the tension in her own body easing, just a little. It wasn't gone completely, not yet, but she realized that the fear and humiliation didn't have to stop her from trying. Each note was a tiny victory, each chord a small step forward. Even if the room never applauded, even if the mocking never fully stopped, she had done something brave. She had faced their judgment and kept going, and that was a triumph in itself. The more she played, the more she focused on the music instead of the mockery. She noticed the subtle smile on one older guest's face, the quiet attentiveness of someone who hadn't laughed at all. Their attention reminded her that not everyone was there to ridicule her. Some were there to experience the moment, to feel the music, and perhaps to see a human story unfold in front of them. And so, with trembling hands but a growing heart, she continued to play. Each note became a statement, not just of her skill, but of her courage. She might be small, poor, and afraid, but she was no longer invisible. She was seen, even if just a little, and she refused to let the voices of mockery drown out the sound of her own determination. By the end of what felt like an eternity, she had played a few simple melodies, but each one carried the weight of her struggle, her fear, and her refusal to quit. The room had quieted more than she had expected, and she could feel the tension shift, even if only slightly. The mocking voices were still there, lingering, but they had lost some of their power. She had faced them, and she had survived. In that moment, the nurse realized something important. Fear and humiliation could be overwhelming, but they didn't have to define her. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. And even though she was still afraid, even though the whispers had not entirely vanished, she had taken the first step towards something greater, the possibility of being heard, being seen, and being respected for her own strength. After what felt like an eternity of nervousness and humiliation, something inside the nurse shifted. She had faced the stares, the whispers, and the mocking laughs, and yet she was still sitting at the piano. Her hands, though shaky, began to move more freely across the keys. She started to listen, not to the audience, not to the fear, but to the music itself. The first few notes she struck after taking a deep breath were soft, hesitant, but filled with a strange honesty. They didn't have to be perfect. They didn't need to impress anyone. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the sound rather than worry about what people were thinking. The hum of the piano, the vibration of the keys under her fingers, and the rhythm she could create with her own hands became a world separate from the whispers and judgment. As she played, she noticed small changes in the room. The laughter had quieted, almost fading completely. A few guests had stopped their chatter and were leaning slightly forward, watching her. Even those who had mocked her earlier were now still, their eyes tracking each movement of her fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't completely invisible. Maybe, just maybe, they were listening. Her confidence didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, in tiny increments, with every chord and every note that she struck without faltering. She started to experiment, trying slightly different rhythms, pressing the keys with more intention, allowing herself to feel the flow of the music. The more she focused on the piano, the more her fear began to lose its grip. Her mind, which had been clouded with worry, started to clear. For the first time, she allowed herself to forget the audience, at least partially. She didn't play to impress them. She didn't play to silence the mocking voices. She played because it felt like the only place she could exist fully at that moment. The music became her voice, speaking the courage she didn't yet feel she could say in words. Slowly, a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Not a proud or boastful smile, but a small, private acknowledgement that she was doing something brave. Every note she played carried more certainty now. Her hands, which had trembled so violently just moments ago, were steadier. She was learning to trust herself. Even in the middle of humiliation, the audience, too, began to shift. People who had once whispered to each other now stopped, and some even tilted their heads, listening more closely. A few nods appeared here and there, subtle acknowledgments of her effort and courage. Even the guests who had been the harshest critics seemed unable to look away. They weren't laughing anymore. They were witnessing someone overcoming fear in real time. As the nurse continued, she discovered something remarkable. The more she immersed herself in the music, the less she felt afraid. Each note became a step away from the shame she had carried moments before. The piano was no longer a symbol of judgment, it had become a source of strength. She was no longer just a nurse in a crowded room. She was a musician in her own right, creating beauty in the face of adversity. Her first true breakthrough came when she reached a simple melody she had been practicing quietly on her own in her free time. Her fingers, almost magically, found the right keys, moving fluidly and confidently. The melody wasn't complicated, but it had a gentle, haunting quality that seemed to capture her emotions perfectly. She played it carefully, letting each note linger, and something shifted in the room. The silence was powerful. No one laughed. No one whispered. Everyone listened. The mocking glances were gone, replaced with focused attention. She could feel the tension in the air transform, as if the room itself recognized the courage it took for her to reach this moment. The nurse, still cautious, felt a surge of pride swell inside her. She was finally playing not just to survive the moment but to express herself. Encouraged by the silence, she allowed herself to explore the piano further. Her hands moved with more freedom, her rhythm becoming smoother. She didn't worry if a note was slightly off. She simply let the music flow naturally. The audience was no longer an obstacle, they had become witnesses to something genuine, a human story unfolding through her fingers. Some guests whispered among themselves, quietly impressed. "She actually knows what she's doing," one said softly. Another added, "There's something about the way she plays. It feels real." Their words were faint, but to the nurse they sounded like applause. Each small acknowledgement, each subtle change in expression, gave her courage to keep going. The fear that had almost paralyzed her earlier was still there, but it had transformed. It was no longer a weight holding her down. It had become fuel, pushing her to play with more honesty and feeling. Every chord, every note, carried both her vulnerability and her determination. She realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing to act in spite of it. By the time she finished the simple melody, a quiet sense of awe had settled over the room. The audience, previously filled with doubt and mockery, now sat in respectful silence. Even those who had expected to ridicule her were caught off guard by the beauty and honesty of her performance. The nurse, still seated at the piano, took a deep breath. She had faced the mockery, embraced the fear, and discovered something new about herself. It was a turning point, not just for the performance, but for her life. In those few minutes at the piano, she had learned that courage could emerge from the most unexpected places. Fear and humiliation had been her companions, but she had refused to let them define her. She had transformed a moment of dread into an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. For the first time, she felt a quiet confidence that she had never known before. The room might still judge her, the mocking might not entirely disappear, but she had claimed a piece of herself through her music. Each note she played had been a small victory, and that realization filled her with warmth. She had faced her fear, and in doing so, she had begun to rewrite the story of who she was in her own eyes. The nurse had never imagined that a simple piano could hold so much power. The more she played, the more she lost herself in the music. Her earlier fear and trembling had transformed into focus, and each note now carried not only her effort but her courage, her determination, and a hint of defiance against the doubt she had felt moments before. She began to play a melody that felt familiar, a tune she had hummed to herself late at night after long shifts, when the hospital corridors were empty and silent. Her fingers moved with more confidence, almost like they remembered the song by themselves. The music was simple, but there was a depth to it, a quiet emotion that filled the room. It was no longer just sound. It was a story of struggle, of perseverance, of a person who refused to be defeated by fear. Slowly, the audience began to shift. The murmurs, the whispers, and the smirks faded. People leaned forward slightly, caught by the unexpected emotion flowing from the piano. Some of the wealthier guests, who had been so quick to mock her earlier, now looked uneasy. They had expected embarrassment, entertainment at her expense, and instead they were hearing something genuine, something that reached beyond social class or background. Her fingers moved faster now, yet with grace. Each chord resonated clearly, filling the lounge with sound that seemed to calm even the most skeptical hearts. The once lively chatter of the room had disappeared entirely. Every ear was attuned to the music, every eye subtly fixed on her hands as they glided across the keys. She could feel the energy shift around her. The air was no longer heavy with judgment. It was charged with attention, curiosity, and slowly, admiration. For the first time, the nurse noticed subtle changes in some faces. A few guests who had sneered or whispered now watched quietly, their expressions softening. A pair of older attendees exchanged glances that suggested surprise. They hadn't expected this. Her playing was not perfect in the technical sense, but it had something far more powerful: heart. Every note carried sincerity, every pause held emotion. The audience began to sense the humanity behind the performance, and that struck them more than any skill ever could. She was still aware of the audience, still conscious that people were watching, but their presence no longer paralyzed her. She had found a rhythm in her own confidence, a small bubble of courage that she could expand with every note. Each chord, each melody became a declaration. She was more than her fear, more than her lowly position as a nurse in a crowded room, more than the mocking voices that had tried to belittle her. As the melody continued, she allowed herself to improvise slightly. She added small flourishes, gentle variations, letting the music flow naturally. Her hands moved with more freedom, no longer constrained by fear or expectation. The audience, previously ready to mock, now leaned in, completely captivated. It was as if the music had erased the walls between her and them, and they could finally see her as a human being, a person with talent, heart, and courage. A few guests whispered softly to each other, almost in disbelief. "She's incredible," one said quietly. Another nodded, murmuring, "I didn't think it was possible, but listen to her." Their words were cautious, but they carried respect, a respect she had never received before in such a public setting. She didn't hear them clearly, but she felt a shift. The music had done something she hadn't thought possible. It had changed their perception. The nurse herself began to feel a sense of calm she had never known during such a high-pressure moment. Her earlier terror and humiliation were still present at the edges of her mind, but they were no longer controlling her. She realized that she had the power to transform fear into something meaningful, something that could touch other people. Every note she played was a reminder to herself that courage could exist even in the most vulnerable moments. By the middle of her performance, the room was entirely still. The only sounds were the piano keys and the soft breathing of those in the audience who were holding their attention, caught in the spell of the music. The mocking laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with quiet awe. Even the most skeptical guests could not deny the beauty of what she was creating. She felt a surge of confidence with each passing moment. The melody she had chosen was building naturally now, weaving through highs and lows, giving her a chance to express something she had never been able to put into words. Her playing was no longer about survival, it was about connection. She was connecting to herself, and in doing so, she was connecting to the audience. The energy in the room shifted completely. What had begun as humiliation became admiration. Curiosity transformed into respect. The final few notes approached, soft and deliberate. She allowed them to linger, letting the music fade naturally rather than ending abruptly. When the last key was struck, a profound silence followed. For a few moments, no one spoke, no one moved. The room seemed suspended in time, holding the weight of what had just happened. Then, slowly, the applause began. At first it was hesitant, tentative, but it grew steadily, becoming louder, warmer, more genuine. People were clapping not just for her skill, but for the bravery she had shown in sitting down and performing despite fear, doubt, and humiliation. Some guests even stood, giving her a standing ovation that she had never imagined experiencing in her life. Tears welled up in her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about acknowledgement. For the first time, she felt truly seen, truly respected, and truly proud of herself. The experience had changed something inside her. She had faced her worst fear, and in doing so, she had discovered a strength she didn't know she had. As she rose from the piano, the audience continued to applaud. Some approached her to express their admiration, their words warm and heartfelt. Colleagues who had doubted her now looked at her with new appreciation. Even those who had mocked her earlier seemed to have reconsidered their assumptions. The nurse realized that the power of courage, sincerity, and determination could not be underestimated. In that moment, she understood that the performance was more than just music. It was a testament to the human spirit, to the ability to rise above fear and humiliation and to show the world one's true self. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had become a bridge between who she was and who she could be. And in that room, full of people from different worlds, she had shown them the strength, resilience, and heart that had always existed within her. The applause continued to echo through the lounge, filling the room with warmth and appreciation. The nurse, still seated at the piano, could hardly believe it. Just moments ago, she had been terrified, humiliated, and overwhelmed by the weight of judgment. Now every clap, every smile, and every glance of respect reminded her that she had faced fear and emerged stronger. She rose slowly, her hands still tingling from the notes she had played. Her heart raced, but this time it was a mix of excitement and pride, not fear. Some guests approached her immediately, offering words of admiration. "That was beautiful," one said quietly, almost reverently. Another added, "I didn't know music could feel like that. Thank you for sharing it with us." Their words were sincere, unforced, and they touched her deeply. Her colleagues, who had been watching nervously from the sidelines, now looked at her with a mix of amazement and pride. A few whispered among themselves, "I didn't expect her to play like that, and she really has talent." The nurse felt a warmth spread through her chest. Recognition wasn't something she had often experienced, especially not in moments of vulnerability. But tonight it felt different. It felt real, and it felt earned. Even some of the guests who had mocked her earlier approached, their expressions awkward at first. "I didn't think you could do it," one admitted softly. "But that was incredible." Another nodded, adding, "You played with heart. I respect that." Their words were unexpected, and for the first time that evening she realized that courage had the power to change minds, to soften hearts, and to earn respect where there had only been doubt. The nurse smiled quietly, feeling a mix of relief and accomplishment. She had not only survived the moment, but she had also transformed it. What had begun as humiliation had become a showcase of her resilience, her determination, and her willingness to act despite fear. The applause, the admiration, and the subtle nods of respect were proof that bravery and sincerity could leave a lasting impact. Even in the most unexpected circumstances. As she looked around the room, she noticed something else. People were talking differently now. Their conversations were softer, more thoughtful. Some discussed the beauty of the music, others remarked on the courage it took to perform under pressure. The atmosphere had changed completely from one of judgment and mockery to one of admiration and reflection. It was a small but meaningful transformation, and she realized that she had played a role in it. The nurse stepped away from the piano, her hands brushing lightly over the keys one last time. She felt a sense of closure, as if the instrument had absorbed her fear, her courage, and her emotion and returned them as strength. She had discovered something essential about herself, that even when life seemed overwhelming, when judgment and fear surrounded her, she had the power to rise above it. In the days that followed, the memory of that night lingered. Colleagues and guests alike spoke about her performance, sharing how moved they had been. Some reached out to her personally, praising her courage, while others simply carried the story in their hearts, inspired by the bravery they had witnessed. The nurse herself felt a quiet confidence that had been missing from her life. She knew, now that she could face fear and uncertainty and emerge stronger, and that knowledge became a steady source of inner strength. It wasn't a life-changing miracle in the sense of fame or wealth, but it was something far more meaningful. She realized that courage was not about avoiding fear. It was about acting despite it. The experience had shown her that vulnerability could be powerful, that being true to oneself could inspire others, and that even small moments of bravery could leave a lasting impact. Over time, she began to notice subtle changes in her own life. She spoke up more confidently at work, took on challenges she would have avoided before, and began to trust her own abilities in ways she never had. The memory of that night at the piano became a touchstone, a reminder that she could face fear, overcome doubt, and express herself fully, even when it felt impossible. The nurse also began to see the world differently. She understood that people often judge quickly, sometimes harshly, but that first impressions could be changed through honesty, courage, and persistence. Her performance had been a small act, but it had demonstrated that transformation was possible, both for herself and for those who had witnessed it. Most importantly, she had learned to value herself, even when others doubted her. She realized that humility and courage could coexist, and that true strength often lay in the quiet determination to continue despite fear and uncertainty. That night at the piano had been a turning point, not because it made her famous, but because it gave her a sense of self-worth and confidence that she had never known before. Looking back, she could still feel the nervous energy that had coursed through her at the beginning, the fear that had threatened to paralyze her. But she also remembered the small victories, the first notes she had played despite trembling hands, the slow realization that the audience was listening, and the quiet satisfaction of discovering her own inner strength. Those memories became a source of empowerment, a reminder that courage grows in the moments when it is most difficult to find. Even now, whenever she faces a challenge or feels doubt creeping in, she recalls that night. She remembers the transformation from fear and humiliation to confidence and recognition. She remembers the power of taking one step, no matter how small, in the direction of courage. And she remembers the applause, not for perfection, but for the bravery it took to try. In the end, the nurse understood that life often places us in situations that seem impossible, where judgment and fear surround us. But those moments also hold the potential for growth, for connection, and for transformation. By stepping forward, by facing the piano, she had not only discovered her own strength, but had also inspired those who had once doubted her. The night had become more than a performance. It had become a testament to human courage, resilience, and the quiet power of staying true to oneself, even when the world seems ready to laugh. And so, she continued her life with a new sense of confidence, carrying the lessons of that night with her. The experience at the piano had taught her that bravery is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the courage to act in spite of it. She had been humiliated and afraid, but she had faced the challenge, and in doing so, she had discovered something far greater than applause. She had discovered herself.